Okay, let's do the heart. We just did the blood, and now the next part of the cardiovascular system is going to be the pump for the blood, which is going to be the heart. This is a pretty long chapter, but it is a pretty easy to read chapter. Um, Usually I take 2 days and spend on the heart, but you get it all in one fell swoop. Aren't you lucky? Here we go. The heart is actually a double pump, and it's pumping blood into two types of circulation or two types of circuits. There's a pulmonary circuit, and everything to do with the pulmonary circuit has to do with the lungs. So the blood the blood vessels that leave the heart go to the lungs, have gas exchange, and then go back to the heart. It is all part of the pulmonary circuit. Everything else is the systemic circuit. Systemic circuit is blood that leaves the heart, goes to all of the other body tissues other than the lungs, and then back to the heart. The heart is a hollow organ, and it's made of chambers. The upper chambers are called atria, that is plural. Singular would be atrium. And then the chambers on the bottom are the ventricles, singular being a ventricle. The atria, they are the receiving chambers. They're receiving blood from the pulmonary and the systemic circuit. The right atrium receives blood from the systemic circuit. The left atrium receives blood from the pulmonary circuit. And then the ventricles are the ejecting chambers or the pumping chambers, because whenever the ventricles contract, they are pushing blood into the pulmonary or into the systemic circuit. When the right ventricle contracts, it pushes blood or ejects blood into the pulmonary circuit, and then when the left ventricle contracts, it's pushing blood or ejecting blood into the systemic circuit. Both atria, right and left, will contract at the same time, and both ventricles, right and left, contract at the same time. Let's follow the circulation. Whenever we talk about the flow of blood through the heart, we always start with the right atrium. So we have blood going into the right atrium from the systemic circuit. Those specific blood vessels we'll go over many times, but it's going to be the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and then the coronary sinus. They all lead to the right atrium. And then when the right atrium contracts, pushes blood through a valve called the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. And then whenever the right ventricle contracts, it ejects and pumps blood to the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary circuit through the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk leads to the pulmonary arteries, which then lead into the lungs. And we have gas exchange. We're going to drop off carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen. Once we've picked up the oxygen, it's going to go back to the pulmonary veins. The blood of the pulmonary veins then lead to the left atrium. And then when the left atrium contracts, blood goes to the bicuspid, also known as the mitral valve, into the left ventricle. And then when the left ventricle contracts, it ejects blood through the aortic semilunar valve into the systemic circuit. And we start with the aorta. And then blood goes through the systemic arteries. Eventually it's going to reach the systemic capillaries, where there's going to be an exchange of gas. It's going to drop off the oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide. And then that blood's going to go back. If it's coming from below the heart, it's coming up through the inferior vena cava. If the blood's coming back from structures above the heart, including the upper limbs, it goes through the superior vena cava, and then we're back at the beginning with the right atrium. The heart sits inside of the thoracic cavity. It happens to be in the very middle of the thoracic cavity, right behind the sternum, and that part in the very middle is called the mediastinum. So the heart lies within the mediastinum of the thoracic cavity. On either side of the thoracic cavity is going to be one of the lungs, the right lung and the left lung. So there's a lung on either side of the heart. The heart is basically a triangular shaped organ or pyramid shaped organ. Anytime you have something that is triangular shaped or pyramid shaped, there's going to be a base and an apex. So the base of the heart is going to be up here. It is superior. The base of the heart is where all the blood vessels enter and exit into the heart. The apex of the heart is going to be right there where it comes to the point. Now we talked about the chambers of the heart earlier. The bottom chambers are called ventricles. The largest ventricle is the left ventricle. The left ventricle is so large that it makes up the apex of the heart. They're basically what they call four corners of the heart. There's only two that I think are really that important for you to know. The superior right corner and then also the inferior left corner. The superior right corner is on the right side of the thoracic cavity. And remember, this is on the patient's right, which is going to be on your left. So in the patient's right, it's underneath the costal cartilage of the third rib in the sternum, but it's on the right side. The apex of the heart is going to be the inferior left corner, and it's between the fifth intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line. The intercostal space is going to be the space between ribs. So the space between the fifth and the sixth rib, that's where the apex of the heart lies. So the heart lies to the left. That's why they say it's better for you to sleep laying on your left side because it's easier for your heart to pump that way. There is a sac that surrounds the heart. It's called the pericardial sac or the pericardium. I'm going to go over the layers here and then go to the picture. The pericardium has two layers to it. There's a fibrous layer and a serous layer. The fibrous, anytime something says it is a fibrous layer, a fibrous anything, that means it is a strong or a tough layer. It's hard to rip. The serous pericardium actually has two layers to it, and we went over this way back in the first chapter. We have a parietal layer of the pericardium and then a visceral layer of the pericardium. Let's look at the picture. Okay, and the top here is the fibrous pericardium. It's on the very top layer. The next layer fused to it is the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. And then the layer that's on the outer surface of the heart is known as the visceral layer of the pericardium. It's also known as the epicardium. Now there's a potential space. I'm going to color it in with the highlighter here. This potential space is known as the pericardial cavity. So it's a potential space between the parietal and the visceral pericardial layers. It's called a potential space because it's not actually that obvious as it is in the picture. But it's not an air-filled space. It has a fluid in it. It's a serous fluid, which is a lubricant, because your heart beats all day and all night. And if it didn't have that lubricant in the pericardial cavity, then every time the heart would beat, it would rub up against the tissues surrounding it, which would cause friction and heat. So if there's an infection of the pericardium, it's called pericarditis, and that part of the pericardium is missing the serous fluid, and it does cause a lot of pain and heat. All right, and then we have the layers of the heart. There are three layers of the actual heart. There's the epicardium, which we just went over, because it's also known as the visceral pericardium. Then we have the myocardium, and then we have the endocardium. The myocardium, myo means muscle, and that's going to be the cardiac muscle tissue that we've talked about, because there's three types of muscle tissue. There's skeletal muscle, there's cardiac muscle, and then there's smooth muscle. We'll look at smooth muscle a little bit with the blood vessels, and we'll look at smooth muscle again when we get to the alimentary canal. But the cardiac muscle tissue is only found in the heart, and that is the myocardium. And then the inner lining of the heart is the endocardium. It's on the inside, and it lines all of the ventricles, and then it continues with the blood vessels as the endothelium. This is a good picture because it shows you the arrangement of the cardiac muscle. You'll notice that in the atria that they form rings, and whenever the atria contract, they will contract at the same time. The contraction starts at the top of the atrium, and then it works its way down. It's kind of a milking motion if you've ever milked a cow or a goat, but it's pushing the blood down into the ventricles. And then you notice the arrangement of the myocardium in the ventricles. It starts at the apex and it works its way up towards the atria. That's because whenever the ventricles contract, they're pushing blood up and into either the pulmonary circuit or the systemic circuit. We're going to start looking at the macroscopic anatomy of the heart, things that we can see in the outside of the heart. We've already talked about the chambers, the superior chambers and the inferior chambers. Superior chambers are the atria. The inferior chambers are the ventricles. Atria are smaller, ventricles are larger. The muscle in the ventricles are thicker than the muscles of the atria, and that makes sense. Whenever the atria contract, they're just pushing blood down into the ventricles. Whenever the ventricles contract, they have to push blood up and into the blood vessel, and the blood has to go further, whether it's going to the lungs or whether it's going to your toes, doesn't matter. That's why the walls of the ventricles are thicker, and of course the thickest chamber of all being the left ventricle. Now, how do they separate it on the inside? They're separated by a wall, and the Latin word for wall is septum. So there's a septum between the atria, and there's a septum between the ventricles. The septum between the ventricles is called the interventricular septum. So inter, I-N-T-E-R, means between, and then ventricular means the ventricles. And then interatrial, inter again meaning between, and then atrial being the atria. Let's look at some of the structures on the outside of the heart. This is an anterior view of the heart, which means we're looking at its front. The upper chambers are called atria. So there's a right atrium and a left atrium. And you remember that when we're looking at the heart from the front, from the anterior or ventral view, then the right side of the heart is on your left. So this is the right atrium over here, and then this is the left atrium over there. And then on the outside of the atria, you'll see that there are flaps. I'm going to kind of outline it with this marker right here. These flaps are called auricles, just like the outer part of the ear is called an auricle. It just allows to have some extra room inside of the atria in case the atria have to push more blood into the ventricles than normal. And then the chambers at the bottom are called ventricles. So the right ventricle is right here, and then the left ventricle is right here. The left ventricle being larger than the right ventricle. There are grooves on the surface of the heart, just like there are grooves on the surface of the brain. I bring that up because they have the same name. It's called a sulcus. The anterior interventricular sulcus is going to be located right here where I'm drawing a line. That's the anterior interventricular sulcus. It does not go down to the apex, it goes to the side. Then there is a sulcus right here, and this sulcus is between the atria and the ventricles. So that is called the atrioventricular sulcus. Now let's look at some of the blood vessels that are around the heart and on the heart. We're going to start with that one right there. This blood vessel is bringing blood from the systemic circuit to the right atrium. That's called the inferior vena cava. And then we work our way around. These vessels are called pulmonary veins. This vessel up here is called the superior vena cava. This vessel is called the aorta. Now the aorta is the largest of systemic arteries. It has different names to the different parts. It starts in the ascending aorta, goes up in this direction, and then the aortic arch arches around in that direction. And then when it goes behind the heart, it becomes the descending thoracic aorta. And then when it goes through the diaphragm, it's known as the abdominal aorta. And then we have these three blood vessels up here. They are from the aortic arch. We'll worry about those when we get to the next chapter, chapter 19. Let's continue around. This blood vessel that I just drew an arrow to, that is a pulmonary artery. This blood vessel that I'm putting an X on, that is called the pulmonary trunk. And then these vessels right here, those are pulmonary veins. Now the vessels that are on the surface of the heart, if it is a red vessel, that is called a coronary artery. And they're bringing oxygenated blood to the myocardium. Whenever there's a blockage in the coronary artery, it deprives all the structures below it of oxygen, and then it causes pain and discomfort, and it could actually make the tissue die, and that's called a myocardial infarction or a heart attack. The blue vessels on the surface of the heart, those are cardiac veins. Now we're going to talk about structures that we find inside or around the heart. And most of these are going to be in the inside of the heart. We're going to start with the right atrium. Inside of the right atrium, they have specific muscles that we don't find anywhere else. They are called the pectinate muscles. So pectinate muscles are found inside of the right atrium. There are some inside of the left atrium too, but they're a little bit smoother, so they don't even matter, or they don't amount to much. I shouldn't say they don't matter, but they don't amount to much. They are more prominent in the right atrium. Then there is a shallow depression that's actually in the interatrial septum, and it is called the fossa ovalis. That is a place in the interatrial septum that used to be a hole. That hole used to be called the foramen ovale. Before birth, there's a special bypass in place to bypass the lungs. So the blood that is going through the fetal heart, so that it bypasses the lungs, it goes directly from the right atrium into the left atrium through the foramen ovale. And then after birth, it heals up and becomes the fossa ovalis. When you look inside the heart, there are 4 valves. Valves prevent blood from flowing backwards. You always want blood to flow forwards. So whenever blood leaves the atria, you want it to go into the ventricles and not back into the atria. When the ventricles contract, you want the blood to go into the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. You don't want it to go back into the atria or into the ventricles. So, 2 of the valves are called AV valves or atrioventricular valves. The AV valve on the right side of the heart, the right atrioventricular valve, is called the tricuspid valve. The other valve associated with the ventricle is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. So that would be the pulmonary semilunar valve. Let me write that out. It's going to be later, but I'm going to go ahead and mention it now. Pulmonary, man, it looks like my 3-year-old niece wrote that. Semilunar, but what do you get for drawing with your finger? Pulmonary semilunar valve. That is between the ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. Other structures that we see inside of the ventricles, we're going to see them in the right and the left ventricle together. But the arrangement of the muscles and the floor of the ventricles has a special name. It's called trabeculae carneae. So trabeculae carneae is the arrangement of the muscles in the floor of the ventricles. It kind of gives it a burnt flesh appearance. I like to call it Freddy Krueger's face. And then there are papillary muscles found inside of the ventricles. The papillary muscles are attached to cords that are called chordae tendineae. They look like strings. They are literally called your heartstrings. So we have papillary muscles that are attached to the chordae tendineae. And the chordae tendineae are attached to your AV valves. They're attached to the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves. Oh, here it is, the pulmonary semilunar valve. I wish I could go back and erase what I did, but it's too much brain effort to do that. All right, so the pulmonary semilunar valve, that is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. Now we have the left atrium. The left atrium is a receiving chamber. It's receiving blood from the pulmonary circuit, and this blood is oxygen rich, which is why the pulmonary veins that lead to the left atrium are red, because it's carrying oxygen rich blood. The definition of a vein is a blood vessel bringing blood to the heart. The definition of an artery is a blood vessel that's leading away from the heart. So the pulmonary veins are bringing blood to the heart, but they're oxygenated blood, so it is red. The pulmonary arteries are carrying blood away from the heart, and it's oxygen poor, which is why they are blue. All right, so in the left atrium, they don't even mention the pectinate muscles because they're not that strong. They're definitely stronger in the right atrium. So the left atrium, it's receiving the oxygen-rich blood from the lungs, and it also has a valve associated to it. The valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle is called the left atrioventricular valve. It has 2 names. It's called the bicuspid valve, or it's also called the mitral valve, either way. So remember, tricuspid is on the right side of the heart. The bicuspid is on the left side of the heart. And whenever we talk about the flow of blood to the heart, we always start with the right atrium. So you want to try before you buy, because the blood's going to go through the tricuspid valve before it goes through the bicuspid valve. And then as we see here, the left ventricle is the thickest. It is the largest of the chambers of the heart, because whenever it pumps, it's pumping blood into the aorta, and it forms the apex of the heart. And it has the same trabeculae carneae that we saw in the right ventricle, has the papillary muscles as well that are attached to the chordae tendineae. Whenever there's been a heart attack and there's damage to the papillary muscles, that means they're not pulling on the chordae tendineae tight enough, and whenever the heart beats, those AV valves could remain open and be leaky, and then blood backs up into the atria, which will cause all kinds of systemic or pulmonary problems. And then the other valve associated with the left ventricle, other than the bicuspid valve, is the valve between the ventricle and the aorta, and it is called the aortic semilunar valve. This picture is a posterior and inferior view. If you remove the heart, held it above your head and looked up, this is the view that you would see. We still have the base of the heart right here, and we still have the apex of the heart that is right there. Let's see, and then we can see some of the same structures we saw before. The red vessels located on the surface of the heart, those are coronary arteries. The blue vessels on the surface of the heart, those are the cardiac veins. Let's actually name some of these blood vessels. All right, let's name this one. We'll start with that one. That blood vessel right there is called the coronary sinus. This is the first time I've mentioned it, but the coronary sinus is draining all the blood from the heart. The cardiac veins are going to lead to the coronary sinus, and then the coronary sinus leads to the right atrium. All right, that is pointing to the pulmonary arteries. That is pointing to the aorta. We can see the branches off of the aortic arch. This blood vessel right here, that is the superior vena cava. And then these vessels right here, there's 4 of them. Those are the pulmonary veins. And again, I said that they're red because they're carrying oxygen-rich blood from the lungs to the heart. And then we have this vessel right here, which is the inferior vena cava. And now we're looking inside of the heart. We can see the thickness of the myocardium. Look how thick this myocardium is right here compared to the right ventricle, or even compared to the atria. Look how thin it is in the atria. Now we can see the pectinate muscles. I'm going to draw an arrow to them right there. Those are the pectinate muscles. You can't really hardly see them in the left atrium, but you can definitely see them on the right atrium. We can also see all of the valves inside of the heart. We have the AV valves. There's one right here. I'm going to label number 1, and there's one right here. I'm going to label number 2. Yeah, if you can read that. So 1 and 2, those are the AV valves. The one on the right, number 1, that is the tricuspid atrioventricular valve. Number 2 on the left, that is the bicuspid or mitral atrioventricular valve. And then we have the semilunar valves. I'm going to name them 3 and then 4. Number 3 is the pulmonary semilunar valve. It is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, which is why it's called the pulmonary semilunar valve. Number 4 is the aortic semilunar valve, and that is between the left ventricle and the aorta. Now let's look inside of the ventricles. We see the arrangement on the floor of the ventricles, like right here and right here and right there. That's the trabeculae carneae. And then you see these muscles. I'm going to put a box around them right there, and then right here. Those are the papillary muscles, and they're attached to these structures right there, which are the chordae tendineae. The chordae tendineae are only found in the AV valves. Whenever the ventricles contract, the papillary muscles contract at the same time. They pull on the chordae tendineae, and they keep the AV valves closed. They don't close the AV valves, they just keep them closed so that the force of the pressure of the blood does not make those valves go backwards. Let's apply a little bit of physiology to the valves, and we'll start with the AV valves. When are they open and when are they closed? The valves are going to open whenever the pressure inside of the atria of the blood pressure inside the atria is higher than the blood pressure inside of the ventricles. So the AV valves are going to open, especially whenever the atria contract. So the AV valves are open during atrial, and we're going to look at this word systole, S-Y-S-T-O-L-E. It's later in the PowerPoint, but systole means contracting. So whenever the atria are contracting, the AV valves have to be open. Now, when are they going to be closed? The purpose of the valve is to prevent blood from going backwards. So the AV valves have to be closed whenever the ventricles are contracting, and that is called ventricular systole. All right, so the AV valves are open during atrial systole, and they're closed during ventricular systole. This picture here is showing you how they close. The papillary muscles close, they contract, they pull on the chordae tendineae, and then they keep the AV valves closed when the ventricles are contracting. And then we have the semilunar valves. There's the aortic semilunar valve between the left ventricle and the aorta, and then we have the pulmonary semilunar valve between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. When are they open and when are they closed? Well, if they're closed to prevent blood from flowing backwards, they would be closed during ventricular diastole or ventricular relaxation. So the semilunar valves are closed during ventricular, I'm just going to abbreviate it, vent diastole. Diastole means relaxation. That is when the that's whenever the chambers are filling with blood. So whenever the ventricles are filling with blood, the blood is coming from the atria, not from the pulmonary or the systemic circuits. So when are the semilunar valves open? The semilunar valves have to be open in order for blood to leave the ventricles and go into the aorta. So they're open during ventricular systole. Technically, the semilunar valves have nothing to do with the atria because the semilunar valves are only associated with the ventricle and the next blood vessel. If you have ever listened to a heartbeat, whether it's through the stethoscope or just putting your ear up against someone's chest, there are two parts to a heartbeat, and they have specific names for the sounds. So the heart sounds, they're called the lub-dub. Sound 1, or the first sound, has to do when the AV valves are closing. Sound 2, the dub, has to do whenever the semilunar valves are closing. So the sound that you hear are actually the sounds of the valves closing, and it makes a little bit of a brewy sound. That's what they call it whenever you can hear the blood rushing through a blood vessel. So it's called lub-dub. The first sound is the AV valves closing, the tricuspid and the bicuspid. The second heart sound, the dub of the lub-dub, that's whenever the semilunar valves are closing. The next slide talks about the pathway of blood through the heart. And whenever we talk about the pathway of blood through the heart, I've mentioned it before, we always start with the right atrium. So we're going to talk about how blood gets into the right atrium, how blood goes through the heart, and how it goes through the systemic circuit and how it goes through the pulmonary circuit. I did do this at the beginning of this PowerPoint, so you can go back to the beginning or just look at it here. The blood vessels that lead to the right atrium, we have the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, and the one vessel they don't show in this picture is the coronary sinus. So those are three sources of blood that's bringing oxygen, poor blood, into the right atrium: superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. And then as the blood fills into the right atrium, it's going to fall through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then the atria contract. And then the ventricles start contracting. They build up pressure in the right ventricle. Whenever the pressure inside the right ventricle is higher than inside the pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary semilunar valve opens. And now blood goes into the pulmonary trunk and into the pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries lead to pulmonary capillaries, and pulmonary capillaries are at the alveoli where we have gas exchange. Oxygen coming in, carbon dioxide going out. So not only we have oxygen inside, so then the oxygen goes into the pulmonary capillaries, into the pulmonary veins. Pulmonary veins, there's 4 of them, 2 from the right lung, 2 from the left lung. These pulmonary veins go into the left atrium. And then when the atria contracts, blood goes through the bicuspid mitral valve into the left ventricle. And then whenever the ventricle contracts, it pushes blood through the aortic semilunar valve into the systemic circuit. The largest of the systemic arteries is going to be the aorta. And then the systemic arteries lead to arterioles, lead to capillaries. So the systemic capillaries, we have another gas exchange. We're going to drop off oxygen and then bring in carbon dioxide. So now the blood is going to be returned to the systemic veins, back to the heart, into the right atrium. So that is the pathway of the flow of blood through the heart. And I know there are going to be questions on the test. What's after this? What is before this? What is the function of this valve? Remember, the function of valves is to prevent blood from flowing backwards. So if I ask you, what is the function of the pulmonary semilunar valve? The function of the pulmonary semilunar valve is to prevent blood from flowing back into the right ventricle. If you were to count how many heartbeats that you have in a minute, normally it's around 70 to 80, and they call that your heart rate. So 70 to 80 beats per minute at rest is about normal. And remember, I mentioned this earlier, systole, when it comes to the chambers, atrial systole or ventricular systole, that means it's contraction of a heart chamber. Diastole, that is whenever it's a filling. That's what they mean by expansion. Whenever blood is filling into the ventricles, they expand, and that's called diastole. This is a good picture. It's showing you the difference in muscle width between the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Here's the left ventricle. Look how thick that is compared to this one, which is the right ventricle. And it's because whenever blood leaves the left ventricle, it's pushing it at a high pressure. And that has to do with creating a pressure gradient. And we'll go over that ad nauseum when we get into physiology. This slide's talking about what the cardiac muscle tissue looks like underneath a microscope. It is the myocardium. We went over this a couple different times, but the cardiac muscle tissue is striated. Well, what does that mean? That means that it has alternating light and dark bands. It has to do with the arrangement of the actin and myosin filaments. So they are striated, just like skeletal muscle. It is involuntary, just like a smooth muscle. And they are short cells, and they are branched cells, and they have these special connections between the two called intercalated discs. These intercalated discs are part of what they call desmosome, which is an anchoring junction, and is part gap junction. And a gap junction is basically a hole or a tunnel between cells. So if there's a gap junction between two cells, they can pass signals to each other and allows the two cells to act like one cell. Don't worry about the mechanism of contraction like the sliding filament mechanism. We did that with the skeletal muscle. I'm not interested in doing it again for the cardiac muscle. We're going to skip this part. I'm going to talk about the cardiac conducting system on this slide, and then we're just going to go straight to the picture. The cardiac conducting system is talking about conducting electrical signals. That's one of the characteristics of cardiac muscle tissue. It has the ability to be excited and to contract. Well, the ability to excite itself has to do with the nervous system. So there are a series of nerves in the heart. The heart can generate its own heartbeat. They call it autorhythmic because it can start its own heartbeat. It does not need the nervous system for that. The nervous system can either speed it up or slow down the heart rate. But the cardiac conduction system starts with something called the pacemaker of the heart, and that's going to be the SA node. Let's go to the picture and show you the pathway of the electrical signal through the heart. All right, we start with the SA node. The SA node of the heart is located in the upper right atrium. So it starts the heartbeat, it starts the depolarization of the muscle tissue. Now, it passes along a pathway called the internodal pathway until it reaches the AV node. So the SA node was first, and then the AV node is second. The AV node delays the heartbeat just a little bit to allow the ventricles to fill with the maximum amount of blood possible. All right, let me switch colors on this pen. All right, we're going to continue tracing the pathway of the electrical message. From the AV node, it goes through something called the AV bundle, or the bundle, and then it splits into bundle branches. There's a right bundle branch and there's a left bundle branch. And then it goes to the apex and it comes up and goes into the papillary muscles through fibers called Purkinje fibers. So we have the SA node, the AV node, the AV bundle, and then we have the bundle branches. And bundle branches lead to the Purkinje fibers. Whenever the ventricles contract, the trabeculate carneae contracts at the same time as the papillary muscles, so that the papillary muscles will pull on the chordae tendineae to keep the AV valves closed. And like I said on the last slide, the heart can generate its own heartbeat. It's called autorhythmic, but the nervous system can influence your heart rate. And it has to do with the autonomic nervous system. That would be the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system is going to slow your heart rate down just a little bit. The sympathetic nervous system is going to speed it up. The sympathetic nervous system is in control all of the time, but the parasympathetic steps in and slows it down. And then whenever you go into the fight or flight mode, the parasympathetic system will step back and just allow the sympathetic nervous system to take over. With the blood supply to the heart, the very first branch off of the ascending aorta is going to be the coronary arteries. They are right there, right at the aortic semilunar valve, because the very first organ that we want to supply with oxygenated blood is going to be the heart itself so that it can keep beating. Now, there are different names for the coronary arteries, like right coronary artery or left coronary artery, so on and so forth, but we don't need to know their specific names. We're just going to remember that they are coronary arteries. Now, the veins are not coronary veins. They're called cardiac veins, and they're going to take the oxygen-poor blood back to the right atrium. But it goes through one specific vein. It's called the coronary sinus. So the coronary sinus is a specific name I want you to remember because that is the vessel that leads to the right atrium. Remember, there are three vessels that lead to the right atrium: superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. The last part of this PowerPoint has to do with disorders of the heart and different diseases. And I've mentioned it before. Heart disease is one of the leading causes of death in the United States. So you probably know somebody that has heart problems. So I'll let you look at this as an easy read. There are no questions about the disorders of the heart. I just wanted you to look at them to be familiar with them in case you had any questions about them. But if you have any questions about the rest of the material, just let me know.